In the northeast of England near Sunderland lies a grassy mound called Penshire Hill. It is encircled by 3 strange ridges, forming steps to the top. Now, you may wonder what could have caused such strange rings on a lone hill. Well, some people say that they were caused by the terrible Lambton Worm. Years ago, Lord Lambton was the lord of the manor thereabouts. His land was a gift from the king, and in return, he trained men from his villages to shoot arrows and wield swords, and would send them to the king whenever an army was needed. Now, you might think the men would not like to leave their loved ones and be sent away like that, but Lord Lambton allowed their families to farm and rear their animals on his land. They just had to give Lord Lambton part of everything they produced, and in return, he promised to protect them. Remember that. One day, the Lord's lazy son, John Lambton, went down to the River Wear to fish. He was a rotten shot with arrows. He was timid with a sword and too spindly to be a good knight, but he did like a spot of fishing. He cast his line into the deepest waters and at once felt a sharp tug at his bait. "Ha! I've got a fine fish here!" he cried, straining at his rod, and out he hauled a fat, slime-strung, squirming worm. It was bigger than a cat, more like an eel than a worm really, with a head like a melon, eyes like ping-pong balls, and jaws crammed with pointy teeth. Young Lambton tied the worm up in his fishing bag, hoping it wouldn't bite through the leather. Wondering how it would taste if the castle cook made it into an eel pie with onions, peas and a few mushrooms, he packed up his fishing tackle and set off for home. The worm, however, hated the scrapey dryness of the bag, and it wriggled and writhed and struggled to escape. It dragged its teeth along the inside of the leather, trying to gnaw its way out. John was horrified to see the beginnings of a small hole. He did not want those teeth tearing at his flesh, so he ran, dodging in and out and up and down until he came to the ancient well at the edge of the village. People said that the water in the well had magic powers, and if you sprinkled it about, it kept evil away. Just what I need to put an end to this disgusting creature, thought John. He leaned over the well's edge and pulled the ties on his fishing bag and listened for the plop as the writhing worm fell into the water and sank. He whistled all the way back to the castle, drying his slimy hands on his cloak, and thought no more about the nasty worm. When he arrived back home, his father was waiting with shocking news. He had enrolled his lazy son in the king's army. Despite his pleading, John had to go. "It'll make a man of you, boy," said his father. Meanwhile, in the depths of that well, the worm slithered into a crevice, squeezed down a tunnel, and oozed into the river among the reeds and weeping willows. There it hid and grew, and grew, and grew. Its worminess became more dragon-like, with legs, scales and claws, a fat pudding head and a flickering tongue that continually tasted the air. The more it grew, the hungrier it got, and soon it turned its gobstopper eyes towards the village farms and grazing herds. Snap! Gollop! The worm ate its way through cows and sheep and pigs, crunching and munching. It spread terror through the manor until the people of the village wailed in horror, crouching in their huts. They could do nothing to stop the worm, so they grabbed their pitchforks and marched together towards the castle, chanting, "We want Lambton! We want Lambton! Kill the worm! Kill the worm! You promised to protect us!" they shouted. "That's the bargain! We farm, you protect!" The Lord called upon his best soldiers and bravest knights, but none was a match for the worm. Lambton was at a loss. What could he do? Soon his lands fell to ruin and his riches were lost. He sent a desperate message to his son to come home. When young Lambton returned, he was shocked to see how bad things were. What has happened? The villagers have been attacked by... Lord Lambton paused and looked about him. A worm. Young John looked puzzled. I do not mean a skinny wriggler of a garden worm, he went on. I mean a stalking, cow-eating, sheep-snuffling, child-terrorising monster. Now, young Lambton thought back to that fishing trip all those years ago. Was this the very same worm that he tossed into the well? Why had he not destroyed it when he'd had the chance? He had been lazy and cowardly in his youth, but now he knew that he had to put things right. He went to the village blacksmith and asked him to hammer out a suit of armour that could help him defeat the worm. Now, the blacksmith's wife was said to be a witch, and she offered to help, but only on condition that the young lord sacrificed the first living thing he met on his return from slaying the monster. Ready to agree to anything, young Lambton collected his metal suit the very next day. It was awe-inspiring, jagged all over, with jutting blades. There was not a finger space of his body that was not covered by armour plating, hinges or chain mesh. My young lord, said the blacksmith, take also this fire-forged sword as a gift from our wife. Its name is Worm's Bane. Wield it well, sire. Poor lad! He could barely lift the broad blade. Dragging the sword behind him, he crammed the helmet on and set off, squinting through the peepholes, and he followed a gruesome trail of bones until, at last, he saw it. The great worm had coiled itself 3 times around Penshire Hill. It was asleep, its twitching tongue lolled loose. Step, 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 clank, creak, clank. Young John edged closer to the monster's head. He had to chop that first to rid himself of the terrible teeth, and then the tail, in case it flailed him flat. He set his legs apart, breathed deeply, and gripped Worm's Bane with both hands. As he lifted the blade above his head, his armour clinked and the worm awoke. Dinner, thought the worm. Thought John. The monster began to wrap his wormy body around the brave knight and started to squeeze, but the blacksmith's armour was too spiky to hold and the monster let go. Young John swung the blade a mighty swipe and away rolled their bulging head. Then swish! He slashed the tail end off and the deed was done. Young Lambton tore off his helmet and threw aside his sword. He had done it. He threw the 3 bits of the worm into the River Wear, where they were carried out into the deep North Sea. He walked back to the castle in triumph, only remembering the witch's curse when he saw his father. Despite his vow, he could not kill his own dad. So that day, a curse fell on the Lambton family that lasted through many generations. Or so they say.